Good morning, everyone. We are approaching noon. So thank you again to the organizers for holding the event and for the invitation. I'm kind of crushing this event as someone who doesn't have an experience in practical interventions on Art Nouveau built heritage, although I have worked extensively on Art Nouveau from the perspective of the architectural and design historian. And I have also worked in heritage conservation in many practical cases, but not in Belgium, elsewhere, in North America and in Canada specifically. So I hope that in the future I will have the opportunity to bring these two experiences together and intervene on the concrete samples of Art Nouveau heritage. Now, I wanted to intervene nevertheless today because I became interested in Art Nouveau very early in my career, in its especially urban dimension. Art Nouveau as an urban phenomenon, its diffusion throughout the city. As I was walking throughout Brussels, I noticed Art Nouveau as an art of detail. That's what drew my interest at first, and that's what became an eventual field of scholarship. On the other hand, in Canada, I have worked in heritage conservation, also at the urban scale, in the conservation of urban districts. And I believe I have gained a few insights that might be interesting to bring to the case of Art Nouveau in Brussels. Insights on one specific problem. In the approach to Art Nouveau, to the heritage of Art Nouveau, what to do, how to assess the work of the so-called minor architects. Architects such as Ernest Blériot in the city of Brussels, who built extensively and who were following the example of the major names, Horta, Hankar, Van de Velde. It is a work that to some extent is derivative, at the same time it is creative. It lacks often the elegance and the originality of the main authors. It is nevertheless important. It has made Art Nouveau what it is today and how we perceive it. The authors like Blériot, the secondary ones, they were responsible for the diffusion of this art throughout the city, and therefore responsible for making it the urban phenomenon that it is in the case of Brussels. And having worked in other cases of heritage scale, of heritage conservation at the urban scale, I think we can gain a few insights in when we approach the work of the so-called minor authors in the city of Brussels. I have worked on the heritage conservation plan and the bylaw of the town of Old Lunenburg in Canada. It is a World Heritage Site. It dates back to an 18th century colonial town established by the British, built on a colonial grid. Its typologies are largely vernacular. It consists of residential types, houses. And what was interesting in the case of Lunenburg, where we will not find any Art Nouveau detail whatsoever on those parts, is the following. What makes the buildings important in this case is not so much the artistic value or the historical value of each single item, each single specimen, but rather their relation to one another. Each building and each architectural feature in the building contributes to the whole, to the ensemble, or to the district. In this case, this is a heritage district. Both the plan and the buildings and the architectural details, they form what is being conserved today. They contribute to the whole. As I said, the typologies are largely residential, largely vernacular. This was established as a fisherman's community. Most of the constructions were built of wood. And what happens in this case is a continuation, derivation of architectural features from the principal source to the community. What the fishermen were doing was to rebuild historicist details that they had never seen. These were historicist details in Europe of Gothic architecture, neo-medieval architecture, that were transposed to the colonies on pattern books. And the fishermen or the local craftsmen, they simply saw the pattern books and they reproduced what they saw in two-dimensional pages. The the architecture, the details, therefore, are inherently vernacular in their nature and in the quality of the execution. Now, in such cases, what they were adding to the houses were decorative features that reproduced the principal historical sources, as I said. And the value in this case of these decorative features is not so much their artistic quality per se, but how they contribute to the whole. Each of these houses is fitted with something familiar. It is especially features that are projective ones, such as the dormers of the roof, the bow windows, and the porch of the house combined with one another, the cornices, the brackets, the moldings, the trimmings, and so on. All of these, they contribute to the general urban landscape and therefore to the character of the place. Once more, it is not so much the value of each of these elements per se, the artistic value or the historical one, but it is their relation to the urban milieu. And the characteristic elements in this case that we define as contributing elements to the urban landscape includes the relation of the building to the street, the setback of the building from the street, and the relation of the building to the neighboring one, as well as landscape components in the city. Again, these are copies of copies of copies rendered in vernacular mode. Typical in this case, characteristic element is the projection that we see defined as the Lunenburg bump. It is a combination of the dormer with a porch, with a bracket, and the pair of two windows with a pointed arch that are a very, very distant reproduction of the Gothic pointed arch recreated in the fisherman community in Lunenburg. Another example of a colonial district, this time in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, where the plan of the town is once more the grid, colonial, not British, this time Spanish. It is once more a World Heritage District, and once more what is important in these buildings is not so much the exceptional value they have in themselves, but their relation to one another and the way they contribute to an overall urban ensemble, a milieu. And this has important repercussions in how we approach them when we conserve them. Currently, the risk, the challenges in the conservation at the urban scale in such districts is not the loss of heritage, but over-restoration. In the age of global mass tourism and movements, these buildings become Airbnbs, they become coffee shops for the digital nomad, and we see today the conservation, the over-restoration for picturesque effects, but at the same time, the loss of cultural character and those immaterial components of the heritage, that is the cultural heritage. Now, I was stressing the importance of elements that contribute to the milieu, to the character of the milieu, to the character of the ensemble. This is how we tend to approach sometimes heritage districts today, in how each component, each building contributes to this, to the milieu. Now, this is a contemporary approach, but it dates back once more to Belgium, to the late 19th century, and to one of the contemporaries of the Art Nouveau protagonist, Bulls, who, back in the 1890s, he also described how the value of the buildings does not lie in each building in itself, but in the relation to one another, and in the relation to the urban fabric, and in how they contribute to the creation of a milieu. The character of an historical place, the character of a milieu, that buildings, streets, streetscapes all jointly contribute to together. He is developing this theory, this aesthetic theory, at the time when the focus is on the monument, and he is one of those who is reminding the readership of the time that besides the monument there is the ensemble, the character, which has a character, and what underlies this character is different compared to the typical components of a monument. Which brings me back to Blériot. Ernest Blériot is one of the minor architects of Art Nouveau in Brussels, but nevertheless important. Blériot was trained in the Saint-Luc system of schools. He is not a classicist in training. He was trained in neo-medieval design, let's define it this way, and this will show off in his works. Blériot is important for another reason. He was an architect, but he was also a developer. So he built extensively, between 60 and 80 houses in Brussels between the 1890s and the early 1900s. So he exemplifies the figure of the architect entrepreneur that builds. And he also builds ensembles of buildings, meaning several groups of houses together, as well as portions of the street. And in this regard, his role is rather rare, if not unique, as an Art Nouveau creator of ensembles. Because he has been a minor architect, and for several other reasons, scholarship on him has always remained very limited, if not non-existent at all, with the exception of a master thesis, a memoir at the Catholic University of Leuven, and a recent publication. Once more, just like in Lunenburg, we see that what renders his building particular, what renders his manner particular, are very often the projections. The bow windows, in this case, combined with a system of brackets and cornices. Now, Blériot also comes to the attention of scholarship for the first time in the 1970s in a text that we have seen in these proceedings many times, in the compendium by Borsi and other authors, Brussels 1900, where after having studied Horta, they also turn to this very strange urban phenomenon throughout the city, and that is where they incorporate the work of Blériot. I think it was Loyer in one of the previous conferences where he defined one of the problems that Borsi and the others dealt with for the first time in the 1970s when they were looking at this urban heritage, what to do with it, how to define it, how to describe it, how can something be described that includes Horta and all the other architects. And of course, his work has been included in other encyclopedias of Art Nouveau, like the one by Van den Breden, which unfortunately was discontinued after the first volume. That is his place in the history of architecture, and if we move to heritage, to his place in the heritage of Brussels and in the conservation of heritage, it was very often the members of his family. Blériot, he had 4 daughters, and there are descendants of the 4 daughters. It was the members of his family who were pushing to have his heritage recognized, valued throughout Brussels. And once more, heritage, patrimony, it goes back to the roots of the word, which in the origins meant the heritage of a family, and in this case, it is literally the members of the family who are stressing the importance of his architecture. Now, the problems that the members of the family had, and the other scholars have with Blériot, was once more the value of his architecture, how to define him vis-à-vis the rest of the production of Art Nouveau. And we find in these articles a few arguments on what renders his work important and special. They all have to deal with a big complex, him versus the major names, Hankar and Horta. So we find, for example, his importance defined in the following terms. Whereas Horta was the architect of the high bourgeoisie, of the elite, he was the architect of the people. He rendered Art Nouveau accessible to the people because he built extensively houses which were significantly cheaper. And therefore, he takes the role of the vulgarisateur of Art Nouveau. On the other hand, his neo-medieval training will result in characteristic elements of his architecture, the lack of symmetry, the creative component, and so on. Now, a few of his houses were in fact classified, and they received the heritage classification from the region of Brussels, including the first ensemble in 1995. It is a group of 2 houses, a residential unit and an atelier of Louise Hem that was classified by the region in the 90s. Now, if we read the document on the classification, we see once more what is being highlighted is the artistic and historical value of the building per se. That is what the authors are trying to argue in this case. They defined the group of 2 as a major work by Blériot and they proceed to point out its value. Value, again, that is artistic and historical in the case of Brussels and in the case of Blaireau's work. Now, also his work has been included in the typical inventories of the Art Nouveau heritage in Brussels that are available online. And here I would like to go back to the other dimension of his work, which is the urban one. His work as ensembles and his Art Nouveau detail as elements that contribute to the milieu, to the character of the milieu, to the character of those portions of the city of Brussels, because he was an architect entrepreneur, so at the same time he developed streets and blocks of houses. This is one of his ensembles. It is located at the cross streets near Saint-Boniface in the neighborhood of Ixelles, and you see in the red lines the streets which were opened and the houses were subsequently built by him. So it is a rare example of the architect entrepreneur that designs jointly portions of the city fabric as well as the decorative elements in them. In circle is the cross street where the group of houses, the ensemble by Blaireau, is located. That's the example of Saint-Boniface. And here, his architectural details, his Art Nouveau details, in my view, they have a higher importance as elements that contribute to the urban landscape. And they contribute to the contemporary daily life in the city in this ensemble, not so much each building in itself. In his case, Blaireau's Art Nouveau was largely limited to the facades, at the maximum to the vestibule of the house, where we find the same details. Everything else behind is a common, typical residence. Once more, details of the manner of the artist that become elements that contribute to the urban landscape. The second example is another ensemble in Van de Schrik Street in Brussels. It is several houses in a row. And once more here, Blaireau is rebuilding a portion of the city. It is a street which has been continued in the straight line that we see on the map near the Port des Halles in Brussels. So he is rebuilding once more the crossing of this street with the existing chaussée de Waterloo. And his blocks line this line this crossing. Now, what happens with the ensembles is that they participate in the life of the city. So the Saint-Boniface is located in a different area of the city, and therefore its life will be different. The type of commerces, the type of activities it attracts are different than those that we see in this part of the city. And once more, this brings the question of how do you approach, how do you value, and how do you intervene in buildings where perhaps the artistic value of the building in itself is not very high, but the value of the projecting components of the Art Nouveau detailing is higher. Can you replace perhaps entirely the facade by simply keep what renders it distinctive as an Art Nouveau design, and by simply preserving or highlighting the elements that contribute to the urban landscape in the city? In the future, perhaps this will be a dimension of his work that will gain greater attention and greater importance. In what role Blaireau's work and generally Art Nouveau detail is an element that contributes to a general urban landscape in Brussels. Thank you.